so we should talk. You have a lot going on. And I don't know, I'm sure you have stuff that you want to talk about because you're an idea guy. I do want to make sure that we talk a little bit about nested scrolls and about Turing burrows, which are both really interesting, and I want to talk about the big aha. And in any particular order, or if there's other stuff you want to talk about, and if there isn't, then I'll ask you questions, but you're a good talker, so.
Okay, well, I could start with nested scrolls.
Okay.
I had always wanted to write an autobiography, and I was putting it off. And then I had to go to the hospital. I had some vein burst in my brain, and I could have died, but then I didn't die, and I got all well. It's what they used to call apoplexy. And it was funny because I had just finished writing a story with Bruce Sterling, and I think those some of my best work, the stories that we've done together. But Bruce can be he's a very opinionated person and very outspoken, and so collaborating with him is always, we usually, about 2/3 of the way through, we end up arguing about what we're doing.
Right.
And so then, after I got out of the hospital, I told Bruce, well, you see, you almost killed me by making me so angry. And he said, well, if you would just accept that I'm always right, you wouldn't have this problem. But anyway, that was then, but I realized, I could have died, and I thought, well, if you ever are going to write your autobiography, you really ought to do it now. And so then, so I got into that, and I wrote it fairly quickly in about 5 months, and then I set it aside. I got into a novel, Jim and the Flims, and then I thought, okay, now I'm going to go back and look at the autobiography and, make sure that I wasn't just out of it. I was still recuperating for a little while, but it looked pretty good, and then I polished it some more. And I wanted it to be, I didn't want it to be exhaustive, because Isaac Asimov did these very exhaustive autobiographies that were interesting, but I didn't want to do that kind of thing. I wanted to be more like I was taking a car trip with somebody and we're sitting in the car and I'm telling them stories while we're going along. And that's one of the difficulties in writing an autobiography, is that your life isn't really this linear string of events, because everything reminds you of something else and everything branches out. It's like a fractal. It's like this bush, and then you're trying to turn it into a vine.
Right.
So it's tricky, and it's also you sort of want to kind of keep moving. It's like you're skating on the surface, and you don't want to fall in and just wallow in endless amounts of detail.
Well, I'm sure one anecdote leads directly to another anecdote that is not linearly
often
attached.
Yeah, but I did organize it in linear order, though, because that's what people kind of want, And actually, David Hartwell advised me to put in lots of dates. Always mention the date when something was happening, and that's useful because if I was looking at Virginia Woolf's journals, and she wouldn't have the dates of when things were happening, and then it would be confusing.
Right.
But it's just to stick that in. And then at first I didn't think. First PS said they would publish it in England, and then Tor said, well, if they're publishing it, we might as well publish it too, because we can use their layout.
Right.
And
I guess that works.
So I was happy to get it out, and it's done fairly well.
It was nice to have it in the hardcover too, because the PS one was soft, wasn't it?
No, they did a hard also.
They did.
Yeah, they did also sort of a collector's edition.
I don't think we saw that one.
Yeah. And, but it's always, with so many of my books, I would think, okay, this is the one that'll break me out into the mainstream. This isn't, a science fiction book. It's a memoir of somebody who, isn't just a science fiction person, a mathematician. I'm a computer scientist, so maybe we'll get, a review in the Times.
Right.
But that didn't happen. But I'm glad I got it out there. And
you have such an interesting history. Knowing the people that you've known, I'm surprised that you didn't actually pick up a lot more attention.
Well, I have met some over the years. I've gotten to meet. I mean, I met the famous logician Kurt Gödel.
Right.
That was a big deal when I was in graduate school. He was like, he's like the smartest man. I think the smartest man I would ever meet, and just an amazing person, like a guru. But he always knew what I was going to say before I said it. And
Did you spend a lot of time with him?
Only a couple of hours, but that was such an important event for me.
Yeah.
It's like seeing the guru in his cave.
Right.
Yeah, that was a big deal. And then I got to meet Allen Ginsberg. There was this sort of school in Europa called, they used to call it the Jack Kerouac Institute of Further Studies. And now they call it the Europa Institute. And the Beats would always be there. Oh, Ginsberg and Burroughs and Corso were there. And this was about 1982. And I went out there and I taught a course on... Actually, I was just teaching a course on the philosophy of mathematics. But I always wanted to be a beatnik writer. Or a science fiction writer, or a beatnik science fiction writer.
Right.
So I was thrilled to meet these guys. And as soon as I met Alan, I said, "Can I get your blessing?" Because there's this it's sort of like in a myth where you meet the old writer or the old guru, the old teacher, and you say, "I need your blessing." And so he was into it. So right away he just slams his hand down the top of my head and says, "Bless you." And I said, I want to be a writer like you, and I always liked you. And so that was good. That felt really good. And I got to give a copy of White Light to Burroughs, and he said it looked far out.
Appropriately.
It made me happy. And then Sheckley had always been a big hero of mine. He was the first, I guess he was really the first science fiction writer. I read him when I was about 13, and I liked science fiction a lot then in any case, like anybody in those times. This was 1959. I liked Asimov, I liked Heinlein. And, but Sheckley, to me, he spoke to me more than anyone else. Like there's two aspects of his work that I myself have taken over, is that it's sort of funny. It's not like you're just going for laughs, but there's sort of a satire in it, a humor in it. And then it's also the feeling that he's writing about real people that he knows. He's writing about himself or his family, his friends. And that's something that I came to call transrealism. I like to do this thing where my novels are rooted in my actual experience. So meeting Sheckley was another thing that was a big deal. I met him because I was trying to sell a story to Omni, and then Sheckley had bought it, and then someone of his higher-ups said, "No, don't publish that." And then I was in New York a few weeks later and went out for dinner with him, and then he was living with J. Rothwell Sheckley. They were married then, yeah. And then another incident with Sheckley was kind of cool. He had this other friend, Marty. I can't remember Marty's last name. And Marty had a connection with Tim Leary. And Tim Leary had this idea that he wanted to have a TV show sort of like Nova, like Carl Sagan.
Right.
And it could have been an interesting show. Be various modern topics. He's, a very charming man. And so then Sheckley and I go over to Leary's house, and we're having a story conference, and that was kind of wild. I wasn't high because I was very anxious, but I think Bob might have been high. And actually, at that point, I was also I'd started working as a computer scientist, and then in Silicon Valley, and I had this special circuit board that you can put into your old PC computer. This would have been around 1987, a long time ago. And it was showing these kinds of graphics that I was very interested in. And they were sort of psychedelic. They were called cellular automata. Mm-hmm. And Tim thought that was great. Mm-hmm. So then he would mention cellular automata from then on. So it was, I've been fortunate to meet a number of my heroes over the years.
It seems like you really I mean, you're very philosophical. You have a big philosophy about how you write, and is that? I mean, there's so many writers that, you know, if you talk to them about how they write, they sit down at a typewriter and they're like, the words come out, and it's boggling to me because I think that, you know, people think about what they're doing and they do this thing and they do it with intent, and there's a chaotic and whatever element to it that comes out that makes your writing you in some ways. But do you want to talk about building that theory? Or I don't know, you didn't really, I looked at your last interview, you didn't talk too much about that. You touched on it briefly. Or does it still hold for you?
Yeah, well, if I'm going to write a novel, there's a number of things that come into it. First of all, this to be like a place I want to go. This to be like some scene, something that attracts me to it, something about the world or something that's going to happen. So at the beginning, it's sort of like I'm standing at the edge of a wilderness, and there's this mountain I can see in there somewhere, and I say, I want to get there. But, you know, I don't really know how I'm going to get there, or how I'm going to get back. And when I pick the characters, as I was touching on earlier, I don't always do this, but I like to have the characters very clear in my mind. And particularly when I was younger, I tended to say, well, I'm going to have this character be like my father. Like the character Cobb Anderson in the in the Ware series, he was somewhat modeled on my father. And the character Stay High in those books, he was modeled on a guy that I knew, actually. He was the younger brother of a friend of mine. And that's this trans-real thing. And then the virtue of that, of modeling your characters on actual people, is that then they're not smooth. They're sort of irregular. They're not like dolls. That's one of the weaknesses sometimes in a sort of generic golden age sort of science fiction novel, would be that the characters are very interchangeable people. They're not. They might say, well, let's give this guy a limp, you know, but then, you know, what else? You know? Yeah. So and now I've gotten some more. I guess I've sort of run out of people to use for my characters. I tend to sort of make the characters up a little bit more, but I'll think about them. I'll sort of write a little life story for them and work that out. And I've also, over the years, I've started planning my novels. I find it's very hard to write an outline because, again, there's the peaks, or maybe 2 peaks I'm going to go to, and there's the woods. I don't really know what I'm going to hit in the woods. You know, is there going to be a canyon? Is there going to be a river? So it's not. I can't really exhaustively describe the outline, but sometimes when you're selling a book or trying to sell a book to a publisher without having written it, they would like to see an outline.
Right.
So, but the outline, when I've written them, I've never viewed them as really at all being chiseled in stone.
Right.
Generally, if I have an outline when I finish a chapter, then I go ahead and revise the whole rest of the outline. Because, you know, what's going on now, it's opened up some possibilities. There's things I have to take care of. So,
I actually saw a proposal once of, it must have been pattern recognition or spook country, that somebody, I can't remember, who's his editor? He sent it to us because the proposal is completely different than the actual book came up.
Yeah.
It was like, he had a good idea. We knew that there would be a good story at the end, you know.
Uh-huh.
The main thing is to prove that you're thinking about something interesting, you know.
Yeah, they just want to see that there are some category of ideas that you, so they've never held me. Nobody's editors ever said, well, look, I'm not sure they really read the outline very closely. It's just that's there.
Right.
Yeah, I see some good words. But then the other thing I'll be doing will be working out ideas, more maybe than a lot of science fiction writers. I did, after all, get a PhD in mathematics, and I worked as a computer scientist. And so I really have a sort of scientific frame of mind where I want to have crazy ideas in the book, but I want them to have a sort of internal logic,
Right.
where I want it to hang together. And so whenever I make something happen, then I want to say, well, how does that fit in with my theory of how, how the hyper jump to another place in space is working, or how the travel to a parallel world is working. I'm always working on this whole theory of it. And that's actually, you'd think that would be limiting, but actually it's not, because when I work out the theory, there will be little aspects of it that suggest things that could happen that I might not have thought of happening. Like the book I'm working on now, The Big Aha. There's a certain theory of telepathy based on quantum mechanics that you would, in some sense, merge your wave function with someone. And that works, but there's this catch in that when you then separate back into two people, you can't really remember the experience. So that's sort of something that I hadn't really seen people do with telepathy. You can have telepathy with people, but then afterwards you can't remember what you said to them.
Right.
But that's then, it's sort of an interesting thing to think about, because then it's sort of like you saw somebody in a dream, and you'll have these memories of it, but they're kind of surreal, and they're maybe not accurate.
Right.
Or like when you had this sort of deep romantic conversation with somebody, you don't necessarily remember the words, but you'll remember the feelings.
Right.
So that's
a very cool idea.
Yeah, it's called Oblivious Link. You get or Oblivious Teep. Teep. I like to call telepathy teep. That's another thing that I do while I'm working on a book is I kind of invent a language for it. I like to have short, easy slang words that, because usually in language is it's like this tumbler. It's like when you tumble rocks to make them into gemstones. Everything's been smoothed over the years by everybody using it over and over. And you don't want to have a slang word that's awkward or not easy to say.
Right.
And then I'll get down to thinking, well, what does the word sound like? What does it remind people of? Like in the Ware tetralogy, I called the robots the boppers. Because I just liked the sound of that boppers. It's like big boppers, and somewhere Thomas Pynchon talks about a robo-bopster. And so that's another thing I'll work on. And while I'm working on the book, I'll keep a sort of document that ends up being as long as the novel, which Paul DeFilippo can't believe I do that, But to me, it's when I don't necessarily want to work on the book, then I'll work on the notes. Writing notes.
I tried to open them, my computer won't open them. I think I have a really old Mac. It doesn't like PDFs if they're at all fiddly. But
Yeah, I have all the PDFs of all the notes posted online, but I'll check them if they should.
It was coming up as corrupted, but again, I have the computer I was working on was not the brightest.
Well, that's bit rot. They were made with an older version of Acrobat.
Yeah.
So I'll remake them. But anyway.
Oh, that's a neat idea. Does anybody else do that?
I don't think so.
Their own annotated works, as it were.
Well, that's it. Yeah, that's just this weird scholarly thing I've done, is that there actually is not very much scholarly interest in my work. I don't know exactly why that is. It's funny how certain things become accepted among academic researchers, that this is important.
Right.
I mean, they're always teaching, certain books in high school, and there's something about my books that they've never achieved quite the acclaim that I would like. I mean, though I suppose almost every writer says that, whatever you have,
you want the next letter,
yeah.
You want to be at the top of the next one. Yeah, there's a little bit of that. I think somebody was just saying to me that they went out and spoke to a bunch of people about writing, and thank you.
Thanks.
Somebody, a question was like, how can you still be passionate about your work and you're so successful now? And it's somebody who has had 4 books out and lost their editor during the Black Wednesday, and just got picked back up by tour. It's not like, and he said, I just couldn't break their hearts and tell them this is not success, right? But from that point of view, it is really
Yes.
like having a book out is a success. It's such a terrible succession of further successes to look for, but there you go. Thank you. Oh, great. Here, you don't burn your hand.
Okay,
It came
thanks.
out hot.
Well, certainly when I started writing, I didn't quite grasp what a long row it is to hoe if you want to be a writer for your whole life. I mean, I've published 36 books now,
Wow.
or 35. I'm now working on my 36th, The Big Aha, and that's my 21st novel. So
Wow.
it just goes on and on.
So, let's talk a little bit about Turing and Burroughs, which is a really interesting story. How
Yeah.
did you even, like, where, has this been percolating since you met them, or is it like...
Well, that was, Turing and Burroughs, well, partly because, again, when I moved to California in 1986, I started working at San Jose State, and before I'd been a mathematician with a specialty in mathematical logic, and then at San Jose State, I sort of retooled. I said, I'll start teaching computer science instead. And so I got to be pretty knowledgeable about computers. And I worked there about 20 years, so I was there sort of riding the Silicon Valley wave from around 1986 to 2006.
Wow.
And that was exciting.
Yeah.
And I even dropped out of teaching for a couple of years, and I worked at Autodesk and was writing some software with them. I helped write the software to accompany James Glick's book on chaos. So one of the big figures in computer science is Alan Turing, and he's this sort of legendary figure. He was he generated this idea of what is called a Turing machine, which is a sort of simple abstraction of a computer. And he was able to prove these interesting theorems that, that you can't, well, a sort of daily example, when you're on your computer and you're waiting for it to finish doing something, you'll see a wait icon, like an hourglass, something like that. And Turing showed that even in principle, it's impossible to write a program that would predict how long the wait is going to be. Which is strange. It's sort of like this self-reference thing. The computations can't really know everything about what computations will do. And so that was sort of this fascinating area. And then during his life, he had this way of switching subjects. I mean, then he got into actually helping to design and build some of the first electronic computers. And then he was involved with the code-breaking effort in World War II for the German Enigma code. And then near the end of his life, he was interested in biocomputation. And he was looking into how certain mixtures of chemicals will produce patterns, such as you see on the coats of animals, like the spot on a cow.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote this funny, or to me, funny paper. It's called something like morphogenesis. And he did this immense calculation, and the output was he got a single black spot, like you would see on the back of a cow.
It's like an intense amount of work to get a spot.
Yeah, really intense. Took like this great mathematician, and he worked on it for months. And he was doing a lot of the computations by hand, and he had all these differential equations. So that was... And then the thing that sort of... This sort of kind of exciting kind of thing that makes Turing especially of interest to people is that he was a homosexual, and he had this personality like some mathematicians and computer scientists do of sort of being socially unaware. He'll just say whatever he thinks. So he would just tell people, I'm a homosexual, and would you like to have sex with me tonight? And this is like the 1950s in England. Right. This is not done, And then he got in trouble. It's a long story, but he ended up getting busted, and then he was kind of despondent. They made him take these treatments.
Were they really, enforcing his heterosexuality?
Well, the thing was, he hired a guy to have sex with him, and then the guy stole something from his house. So Turing goes to the police and says, this man stole something. And they said, well, why did you ask, this sort of raffish, kind of lower social stratum person to your house? He said, well, to have sex with him, and we did this and this and this.
So that's all real.
Yeah. And then they had this crazy idea that they should give him female hormones, and that would reduce his sex desire. It made him start growing breasts. It's like the same hormones a transsexual would take. But then
it's like an unlikely theory.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. But then anyway, he was done with that. But then, for whatever reason, maybe this had a bad effect on him. It's easy to imagine that it would. But he was depressed, and apparently he killed himself. And he was really crazy about the movie of Snow White. He thought that was a really cool movie, and he used to dance down the hall and sing the song from the movie. There's something about one side of the apple is good, one side is poisonous. And so when he was found dead with an apple that had cyanide on it, so they concluded that he had put cyanide on the apple and then had bitten it, just for a weird way to kill himself. And I've always had a theory, which may or may not be true, that the British equivalent of the CIA, I guess they would call it the M5, murdered him. Because, this was the Cold War period, and they were incredibly paranoid about homosexuals knowing state secrets, because then they said, well, these men can be blackmailed.
And someone with no self-censoring ability, apparently.
Yeah. Yeah. So he'll be blackmailed. Though, again, Turing probably wouldn't have cared, because he would tell anybody who cared that he was homosexual. But, the spy master would say. And he was doing this thing. He had promised as part of his parole not to have sex with anyone in England. But then he would, go on vacation to Greece or to Scandinavia and have boyfriends there. And then sometimes the boyfriends would visit him in England. And, he would debate to himself whether this meant sex with someone in England if the person wasn't English. So the setup in the book is that Turing has a guy visiting him from Greece, and they're about to have sex. And then, but the Vice Squad is sort of sneaking around watching Turing, and then he's in a hotel with his boyfriend, and the cops send up a pot of tea to the room that has cyanide in it, and Turing's boyfriend drinks it, and he dies. And so then Turing says, okay, they're out to kill me, I have to run, but what I'll do is I'll put this guy in my bed in my house, and I'll leave, but before I do that, we'll switch faces. Well, here, we're getting into science fiction. Okay. But again, it's not completely unlikely, given that he was doing these experiments in morphogenesis. So he basically gets a speck of skin from his nose and his boyfriend's nose, and then grows two faces in the oven, and they puts them on the dead guy and puts the guy's face on his. And then he flees off to Tangier. Now, I wrote this story as a standalone quite a while ago, maybe 10 years ago, and then I read it in a reading in San Francisco. They have a monthly reading there, SF and SF. At that time, Jeremy Lassen was there, and he said, if you ever turn this into a novel, I'll publish it. And then I kept it in the back of my mind, and then at some point I couldn't think of what else to do, so I wrote a sequel, a story, and I thought, I don't know if this will be a novel, but it'll be another story, about Turing in Tangier, and he meets up with William Burroughs. And then they get into this thing, Turing intensifies the biotech thing, where you can actually turn your body into this sort of slug, that slimes around. It's just vintage 1950s styles, alien invasion, mutant invasion science fiction. And anybody you touch has this then ability to turn into a slug, and it's contagious, and they have telepathy, and you can have sex. You can sort of like these videos on YouTube you might have seen of slugs having sex. They hang from the ceiling with a rope of mucus. And
I think I have not seen that. I would probably remember.
Yeah, slime around each other. They're hermaphroditic anyway, so it's So then I had a lot of fun, and then I went ahead and expanded it out to a novel.
I love the letters from Burroughs.
Yeah, that was another thing I really liked doing.
They're really fun.
I'm a huge fan.
The completely different styles of writing
Yeah.
to different people in his life. And
Yeah, I'm a huge Burroughs fan, and I always liked his attitude that it's just, completely sort of in your face, just absolutely no compromise, but also so funny, and homosexual, but in a sort of, it's not in a sort of, weepy way. It's not like he has some disease. He's
right.
just, this is what I like,
right.
in your face, and the same with the drugs. So yeah, I had a lot of fun writing. I've studied Burroughs' letters very closely over the years. The Yeats letters is a good one, and so I wrote some of the chapters in the framework of letters from Burroughs. So then I think it came out as quite a nice novel. But then by that point, Tor really didn't want to touch it. It was just a little too outrageous, I think.
It has its gonzo elements.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great.
Yeah.
I really like it, but it is chock full of stuff and extremes of behavior and science fictional things going on with Scuggs, or however you pronounce
the
it.
Scuggs. Well, it's funny. I always think, I see books being reviewed in the Times, and they're outrageous, and then nobody cares. And then I write what I think is outrageous, and I'm even holding back. And people are, no, that's too much. But then, and as I said, Jeremy at Nightshade had wanted to publish it, but by that time Nightshade they were sort of going down.
Yeah.
And
Well, it's not a great time. I think just because of the economics of the last 5 years, it's not a great time for publishers to make. It's not a great time for places like Tor to take chances.
Yeah.
They are very much sort of hunkered down and being safe. I think it's changing a little bit now, but that was this year, or came out last year.
Yeah, in 2012.
Yeah. So that's it's just a.
Well, my whole life as a writer, which started about 35 years ago. Every year somebody said, this is the worst year in publishing
Really?
ever.
I'm sorry to be the person this year.
No, but this year it is, because the difference now is there aren't any bookstores,
Yeah.
Borders is gone, the Barnes and Nobles are closing down. It's just,
You got to get your
insane.
reviews, and you got to have your online presence, and blah
Yeah.
blah blah. It's just it's a crazy thing. But so you decided to.
Well, then I got
do it yourself.
my old agent, Susan Potter, had died, and I got a new agent, and John Silbersack, and he sent it to kind of a number of people, but they're all, we just don't. This is well written, but we don't want to do it. And so then I thought, now I'm just finally have to self-publish. And again, as an older writer, the younger writers, they don't really have. In my era of self-publishing, had this stigma.
Right. They don't feel aggrieved to have to self-publish.
Yeah, they're not embarrassed about it.
It's funny though, because somebody like Benford is just over the moon about self-publishing. He thinks it's the best thing ever. He can get his whole backlist out.
Well, once you accept it, there's a lot of nice things about it.
But it's a.
But it's a psychological step to take. Well, there's that, and then there's the matter that, depending how you do it. I mean, you can go to e-reads, which is, in a way, it's almost like self-publishing. They will, they're not, I don't think the bar is that high for them, if you're an established writer, for them to do one of your books. But then...
and they said it, and they do the work.
Yeah, they do all the work. But
and
then...
they do a pretty good deal.
They do they're doing a nice job. They're doing a good service. I've got a couple of books with them. And I noticed they just put out all of Paul DeFilippo's backlist.
I was actually thinking about talking to them about Lafferty.
Yeah, I think if you can figure out who has the rights.
We have the rights.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's...
We have the rights. Yeah.
I wouldn't see why not. Why they wouldn't do that.
Just because they... One is Richard Curtis. We know Richard Curtis. So.
Yeah, not everybody likes him.
Yeah, but at least I know him. Like, the other things feel more... We don't want to do it ourselves, and there's other people that we just don't know. And he's at least pro-locus. That helps us a little.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, John Douglas is still there. He's a nice guy.
Yeah. No, he's a nice guy.
That was who I dealt with. But then because I'm to some extent a computer guy, I said, well, I can figure out how to do this myself.
Right.
Because, I mean, the books I get from e-reads, in the end, well, they give me 50% of their net, and then there's other charges in there, so it's really more like I'm getting, well, in the end, compared to the cover price of the book, I'm getting, I might be getting 20%.
Right.
And which is sort of like with Tor,
Right.
But then I thought, well, if I'm self-publishing, it would be nice to be getting, 50%. So I'll figure out how to do it myself. And there went 7 months.
Well, that is the thing.
Yeah.
I just gave this big talk to a bunch of young writers about self-publishing versus traditional publishing, and I was like, they're both avenues. But if the end game is to have someone give you money and say, now go write your next thing, then traditional publishing is the place to do that.
It's nice,
because otherwise you are a publisher.
Yes.
Right? In one case you're an author, in the other case you're a publisher. And, if you already have a background in science and you feel like this is a very accomplishable thing, or you are a marketing machine, or you already do print production or something else, then it's one thing, but there's a lot of people it's not suited for.
Well, it's, just because you're a writer, that's different. Because there's as you say, there's the sort of computer hacker skill, and then there's the marketing skill, which that's actually, that would be my weak point, marketing. I'm not the most sociable person.
Well, it's hard,
Yeah.
It's hard for us.
Yeah.
Like somebody came in and said, you guys should tweet. I'm like,
Yeah.
whoa.
Yeah.
Tweet?
Yeah.
We have to make a magazine.
Well,
When
all
are we
those
gonna
things,
tweet?
they're all like you're in a boat, and you're saying, well, let's make another hole in the boat.
Right. I know.
It's just such a time sink. Just to do my email, and then I do tweet, and I Facebook, and I have a blog, but those things, they really can eat up time. Though, for a writer, it's always good to find ways of wasting time. Other than getting incredibly drunk, or having sex with strangers,
No, all fine traditions and literature,
Yeah.
but not necessarily the way to get the book written.
Well, social networks are a less personally destructive way of wasting time.
There's that. We hope.
Yeah.
We hope. I'm sure there are people who are stretching that
Well, yeah.
taking that to its full potential.
Well, Gibson has been tweeting so much, you have to wonder what he's up to.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm sure he'll find some way to.
He's got a book coming out right now, so he's still working.
Maybe the tweeting will be an element of the book.
Yeah.
I think
he really digs into the. Like he's so excited about the cool things, the technological.
Yes.
And the advances and new gigas and all the stuff that comes out, and it is so part of what the fodder for his writing mill. You know what I mean?
Yes, sure.
But I think that it works hand in hand with what he does.
Yeah. Well, you do. From being online, you do find a lot of useful things. Though at this point, I sort of have enough ideas. I don't know. Just need to write them down.
Yeah. Yeah. So talk about So you was this the first one, Turing and Burroughs, that you self-published?
Well, there was another angle in my getting into self-publishing. There was a book that I admired very much. It was written in the 70s. It's called Be Not Content. It's by a man called William J. Craddock. And he was he wrote this book when he was 21, and he lived in San Jose, and I lived in that neighborhood. And this book was sort of the first book by an acid head. And he started taking it, this was before the Merry Pranksters, really, really early.
Right.
And they didn't even know what it was exactly. And it's just really a fascinating book. And he had just this great humor. In the book, I'd lost my paperback copy of it. I lent it to somebody. There was sometimes you'll lend a book to somebody and then you'll forget who it was. And
Right.
they're idiots. They don't even read it.
And it's just out there on a shelf somewhere.
Yeah.
In a box.
Yeah. So then, But then I found the paperbacks of his book were quite expensive, over $100.
Tell me what it's called again.
Be Not Content.
Be Not Content.
So then I blogged about that, and then that's another thing about blogging. People come to you with scraps of information, and then somebody knew his wife, and she lived in Santa Cruz,
Oh, wow.
which is not all that far from where I live.
Right.
So then I got in touch with her, and I agreed actually to, I got her to do a contract where I was going to publish the book. And at that point, I realized it's not very hard to do an ebook. It really isn't. And then while I was figuring that out, I actually wrote a little book called How to Make an Ebook. So, and then I blogged about it. So that was my first dipping into it. And then his book was more work because I had to scan it and do the
OCR proofing.
Yeah, the OCR thing. But even that, I had some good software. It's a thing called Abby Fine Reader, and that it actually wasn't nearly as hard as I thought it would be. But I mean, it did. You had to proofread it, and I don't know. It used about a month, and then I got into, well, as long as I can do the ebook, then I thought, well, here it's like I'm building a fallout shelter. I'm going to have safety here, because even if I can't sell Turing and Burroughs, I'm going to know how to publish it myself.
Right.
And I said, well, while I'm at it, I'll do my complete stories, because then. And some people said, well, how do you know it's your complete stories? And I said, oh, because I'm going to upload a new version every couple of years.
Right.
So.
And they're yours. You
Yeah.
are actually the person who gets to say that.
Yeah, that's true. It doesn't mean I'm never going to write another story. But,
Right.
Yeah. But that, and that's a sort of a hard type of a book to sell to somebody, and they're not going to really pay you anything, so
Right.
you're not going to really lose anything doing that yourself. And then I figured out, I said, all right, now I'm going to learn how to do a print book. And that was harder because there's this software called InDesign that most people use. And
That's what we use.
yes, yeah, I mean, LOCUS uses it, and I mean, in my years as a programmer and computer science professor, I would say I never found any software that was harder to use than InDesign.
Really?
Yeah. Like the
Wow.
Microsoft C++ debugger is
It's
not as hard.
easier?
Yeah, it's easier than
Oh,
InDesign.
no.
Well, part of it is Adobe, they really don't have very good documentation. I mean, they have documentation, but there's this one thing, there's this initial first step to paste a Word document into an InDesign document. You have to hold down the Shift key and then press Insert.
Right.
And the documentation didn't mention that.
Oops.
But then, you know,
That's because they all do it so automatically they
Yeah.
don't even know their fingers on the
Yeah.
shift key anymore. Right?
Yeah. But you go to the forums and just everything was like that. But then finally, you know, I got over the hump. And
The bummer is when they keep changing it because we have is it 5 or 6 now,
yeah,
and the change between 4 and 5 was a big change. They took a whole bunch of things out of the EPUB because you can lay out
mhm.
a book and then you can generate an EPUB out of it. Right?
That's a very good feature.
Yeah, but they changed a bunch of stuff, and
Yeah.
we were figuring that out, and they don't tell you what.
Well, it's especially
They've taken
hard
away.
with something like Locus because you've got columns and you've got photos. I
And we
mean,
have to we relay out the entire magazine.
yeah, a book that's all text is pretty
Single column.
Yeah, it's wonderful. But yeah, that's another gain of learning InDesign because then you can kind of do it once and then you can save as EPUB.
Yeah.
And you can easily convert an EPUB to a Mobi for the Kindle. But that, like I say, that cost me 7 months. But
Right.
in a way, it was interesting. It was a way of avoiding writing. And then by the time I was finished with all that, at that point I realized I'm actually not going to be able to sell Turing and Burroughs, you know. And so then I said, okay, well here I can do it I'll get it on Kindle, and that's really the main ebook market. At first you imagine the others matter, but
Yeah.
Kindle's 90% of it. And then, I mean, you can do the others too, it doesn't hurt. And then I learned how to make the print book, and there's also, Amazon has this thing called Create Space, where they will list the books on Amazon just like a regular book, and they'll print them on demand. And then I put it on Lightning Source, so in principle, bookstores can buy it from them.
Right.
But
Because they do Ingram and Baker and Taylor.
yeah, Yeah, but that hasn't really seemed to happen. At that point I didn't realize if you want to get listed in Publishers Weekly or Library Journal, you have to send them the book 4 months before you publish it. Which, I mean, next time I do this. The thing about which other self-publishers have said, it's a meager cash stream, but it's steady and it lasts for a while. And you can also sell the ebooks yourself. There's something called eJunkie, where if you get people to go to your site.
Right.
So I have a site called Transreal Books, and I sell it. I guess I've already made about as much off touring in boroughs as I would have gotten as an advance from tour.
Which is pretty good.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, the difference is I get 5 times as much per book,
Right. Well, Tim is doing Kickstarters now, right? So
yeah.
he raises the money in advance.
Well, that intrigues me. I've heard Tim Pratt talk about doing a Kickstarter, and again, that's something. As an old school writer, I had trouble wrapping my mind around that. Spare changing people.
People get really excited about it, though.
Yeah. Well, and then Tim told me this amount of money that he'd gotten. So yeah, I might someday do maybe like the people like my Ware novels. I could do a Kickstarter for a 5th one.
And people they want to be part of that process, and they can't. They couldn't before, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was all mysterious and behind closed doors, and now they can actually sort of insert themselves a little bit. You know?
And just recently, I got a nice piece of money from the Institute for the Future to write a short story for them about some aspect of the future, the aspect of what's going to happen when all objects are networked. And they said, we'll pay you, again, about as much Tor would give me for a novel to write this short story. And then they're going to make it Creative Commons, and it's going to be on Boing Boing.
That's pretty cool.
So that's the other thing that can happen. Your other cash stream is that you can start having people sort of paying you. It's like the thing of saying bands make money from appearances rather than from selling CDs.
Right.
So it's sort of like a personality thing.
Right.
But that's nice. Though, well, Bruce Sterling, he makes a huge number of public appearances. He's an extremely good speaker.
Yeah. And Corey does that.
Yeah, Corey also does that. Bruce has this trick he uses when he's speaking, is that he always sounds sarcastic. He always sounds like he's making fun of what he's saying. And so he'll be presenting some cool thing about the future, but he sounds sarcastic. And so then the audience is thinking, well, he's telling you this cool stuff, but he actually knows more. He knows the next thing. But it's not that he's doing it consciously. It's just the way he talks.
His way,
yeah. But yeah, I've always enjoyed my dealings with him. Well, I've enjoyed all my co-authors. That's one thing about science fiction that you don't see as much in mainstream literature. You don't see people collaborating very often.
Right.
In science fiction, it's much more common. So.
I wonder why.
Well, I mean, a literary person might say because we're writing worthless crap and it doesn't matter anyway. We're like house painters, But I don't know.
I would hope not.
Yeah. I don't know why it is. It's like, I mean, jazz and rock, you have people collaborating a lot. But, yeah, I've really enjoyed my collaborations. Because when you're a writer, you're alone a lot of the time. And then when I'm done with a novel, I'll then often do a collaboration. So I've written stories. I used to love writing stories with Mark Laidlaw. But he's not writing. I mean, I might do that again. He's sort of into game design to some extent these days. And then written the stories with Bruce Sterling that I mentioned. And then Paul DeFilippo and I just wrote a story that's going to be in Asimov's in July. And then...
when does Big Aha come out?
And wrote stories with Terry Bisson as well. And somebody who I'm forgetting. Well, never mind. Anyway, these days I'm working on... John Shirley. Mustn't forget John Shirley. Okay, and then... what I'm working on nowadays is a novel called The Big Aha. And I'm pretty close to done now. I would say I'm 85% done. And the idea, I guess what started me going on this book was one thing I mentioned earlier. I like this idea of telepathy where you can't remember. But I also like the idea, I've always enjoyed writing books that have to do with genomics or the biotech revolution. I think people correctly say that's going to be one of the really big technologies in the 21st century. And we're still just barely wading into it. And I don't think it's unreasonable to suppose that in a century or so, we really would be seeing a lot of our devices would in fact not be manufactured machines anymore. They would be plants and animals that have been designed to behave in ways that we consider useful. And even things like a knife or a glass, it gets easy enough to imagine plants growing those things for us. I mean, it goes back, primitive countries, I mean, they are using our coconut shell to drink out of.
Right.
But we could tweak it so this is more and more what we like. And communication devices, those again, there's all this interest in squid skin. The skin can do almost anything, cuttlefish.
Right.
And that would be clearly a really great visual display. And electric eels send out electromagnetic pulses, and so, that could be the basis of a sort of wireless communication. So there's...
Funny, because it kind of brings things back around full circle, because, I mean, most of the technology, it feels like the origins of it come from things that, you see out there in nature. It's not like we really came up with anything completely brand new,
Well, that's true. Yeah, we said we're going to manufacture these. But, so I wanted to do... I wrote a book a few years ago called Freck and the Elixir. And that was a book that was set in 3003, and that was a book where everything was biotech. But then I wanted to come back to a world like that. And so I've also learned not to ever say the date in a novel. You don't want to put in your sell-by date.
Right.
Okay, so I was saying, so in the Big Aha, I wanted to have a book where it was all live things. And it's not set so far into the future. It's more like 2100, something like that. And another thing that I wanted to have happen in the book, I've always, as somebody, I was born in 1946, and then, so the Summer of Love was the year I graduated from college. And so I really liked that period. And then it was over so quickly, it seemed like. It's just, bam, it was getting really good, and then you had Altamount, and then disco, and suddenly it was over, the 70s. And I wanted to have a story where something like that was happening, but I didn't want to be based on drugs, because everybody by now has sort of ossified opinions about drugs.
Right.
They're for them, against them, and it sort of closes the imagination.
Right.
And so I wanted to have something where there's something that is giving these people this sort of cosmic experience. And then I thought, well, we'll use quantum mechanics. So if you're a science fiction writer, I mean, there's these various sort of nebulous hand waving tools. Hand wavium, yeah. And then, and something about quantum mechanics that interests me is that there's these sort of two modes in quantum mechanics of, you can think of the world as evolving in a smooth wave-like pattern, but then as soon as you start measuring things, then it's this sort of choppy, discrete pattern. That's what they call the quantum collapse of the wave function. And so then I had this idea that in my own mind, this is an idea I've actually had for many years, is that I feel like there's a pulse that happens maybe 3 times a minute, maybe more often than that, maybe 30 times a minute, where I'll sort of merge into the place around me. Like, it's a nice day, you're looking around, you're not really verbalizing to yourself, you're not forming opinions. And then you sort of snap back and you say, oh, well, there's so-and-so, I have to ask them for something, and it's such and such o'clock, I have to get in the car and do something.
Right.
And there's these sort of two modes, and just to call them something, I call them the cosmic mode and the robotic mode. And you're sort of, it's almost like sonar. You just kind of ping out with the cosmic mode, and then you pull back with the robotic mode and think, what am I going to do about it?
Right.
Yeah. And so then the gimmick that I have in the Big Aha is that people get quantum wetware. There's a great phrase, quantum wetware. So wetware is already sort of an intriguing word. It's sort of like what's going on in your body, your DNA, your chemicals, and then make it quantum, where you can consciously control how rapidly you do the oscillation between cosmic mode and robotic mode.
Right.
And so these guys, they're party people. They just wedge it open. They just get the switch. They wedge it to cosmic, and they're just cosmic, all the time.
Turned on.
Yeah.
Tuned in.
Yeah. So it's like they're acid heads, but they're not taking any drug.
Right.
And so, and then they get these sort of animals they've made. Like instead of a car, you'll have a road spider, something like a spider, and you ride on the back. And you're making those things. You're giving them quantum wetware as well. And you can sort of get into the vibes with them and make them change their form. And so the world becomes sort of more spacey.
I imagine.
And then, of course, you always need something bad, So, and it's always good to have an alien invasion,
I agree with alien invasions. Absolutely.
Yeah. So there's these things that are sort of sticking. They're like mouths from another world or another dimension. They're sticking into our world and eating people. And then, so they're having to deal with that. And then the book's called The Big Aha. It's sort of, you always have the dream of getting the big aha, the big vision beyond the white light.
Right.
And they're sort of seeking after that. And then there's also this Zen thing where I was looking for enlightenment, but it was here all along.
Right.
Just the now moment is really the ultimate big aha. So that might be that near the end they're saying, well, maybe that's, it's like, the Wizard of Oz, here I am in my backyard.
Right.
But I'm seeing it with new eyes.
Right.
And so that's, I guess...
and you're almost finished?
Yeah. So I'm not quite sure who's going to publish it. I guess I'm putting a little more sex in it than... Well, I used to know if for sure if Tor was going to publish it, then it might be that I should have less sex. I don't know. David Hartwell once said to me, well, if you're talking with the 13-year-old audience, there's some 13-year-olds who are very interested in sex and some who aren't.
Right.
And you can guess which group is the one that reads science fiction.
That's a great quote.
Yeah.
That is an excellent one.
But, it's not like, the book isn't really about sex. It's just, these are acid heads, they're having a party. So,
well, there's an alien invasion.
Yeah. Yeah, I just did the scene where they have this ballroom, they're having a big party, and then these things, they're like wormholes, they're like these big brown balls pop in and start gobbling people down. And it's, people are kind of upset. And I'm having a lot of fun with it. It's sort of, I do like the classic SF, I call them the power chords.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, that's why I always loved the band, the Ramones, because they were really just playing classic rock and roll, but they were
screaming it.
Yeah, and really just hitting those power chords, and just making the most out of them. And that's to me that was one way I thought of cyberpunk, was the idea of taking the classic SF things, alien invasions, telepathy, giant ants, and just
turning them up to 11.
Yeah, turning them up to 11 and having fun with them.
Right.
So that's sort of what I'm doing in a big aha. And again, I may find a publisher, but if not, I'm confident I can. I know I can self-publish it, and but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. I know. I think it's I think self-publishing has it does have a sort of like checkered past. People would think of it a certain way, but the publishing fields feel so limited right now in some ways that it's at least
Well, it looks
stuff's still getting out there.
well, it looks better and better. It's really the only wrinkle for me is the publicity thing. But if I'm planning it a little better next time, because frankly, I mean, the ebooks finally are picking up. If I look at my backlist royalties, the ebooks are definitely quite a bit higher than the print copies.
Mm-hmm.
And with new books, it's still more. The bestsellers are still doing a lot in paper, but the thing is, again, given that there aren't any bookstores practically anymore. There's no bookstore anywhere near Union Square in San Francisco, which is kind of incredible.
Oh, yeah, no, what's a
And you put something on Amazon, people don't care really who the publisher is.
Right. And I only know of, like, there's a Barnes & Noble in Emeryville.
Oh.
Other than that, I only know
I'm sorry,
about the little
Little Kent.
bookstores. There's just not. The one in
Yes.
Jacqueline Square, that was Borders, I guess.
Yeah.
But there were like 3 Borders in town there.
Yeah, and there used to be a Barnes & Noble on Shattuck. I don't know if that's still there. And Cody's is gone. It's insane. So it does make, certainly the self-publishing model makes more sense, but you always feel like you get a little more visibility with a publisher.
Oh, it's definitely.
Yeah. But again, there's that trade-off where they're going to give you 10 or 20% at best.
Right. You just
And-
hope they sell.
And you're going to have to
Orders
hope
of
that they're
magnitude.
accounting it in a way that
These fans.
is to your advantage.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of trust. There's
Yeah.
a lot of trust. So.
Yeah. But I mean, self-publishing, they're just paying it into your bank account
Right.
as they sell. That's very nice.